Hey everyone, this is the second of two videos on the interwar period. In the previous video, talked about the period between the end of World War I and the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. And in this video, we are going to be talking about the years 1933 to 1939, which is to say the years between the Nazi seizure of power and the beginning of World War II. And I'm going to be trying to answer three questions in this video. The first is, what are the characteristics of the Nazi totalitarian state? The second would be, what are some examples of racism in Nazi Germany? And the third would be, what are some of the steps that Hitler took that led to World War II? Okay, so the first question is about what are the characteristics of the Nazi totalitarian state? And in order to answer that question, I want to go back to something we said in the previous video, which is the idea that one of the fundamental ideas of fascism is that the individual is subservient to the state. And while that may seem strange that that idea would appeal to people, it was actually quite appealing to many of the lost generation, because the Nazis said, you do have purpose and meaning. Your purpose and meaning is in serving the state and in serving Hitler. So what are some examples of the ways in which the Nazi Party created opportunities for people to serve the state? Well, one example is mass political rallies, right? And so these mass political rallies would be a combination of like a festival and a rock concert coupled with political speeches. So during the day, you might play games and have contests and listen to music. And then in the evening, you would listen to speeches by Nazi Party leaders, and you would hear the anti-Semitic language. You would hear criticisms of the Treaty of Versailles. You would hear about ways to make Germany prosperous again. So that would be one way you could help serve the state. A second way that you could serve the state, particularly if you were in elementary, middle, or high school, would be to join the Hitler Youth. And the Hitler Youth was a kind of a combination of like the Boy Scouts and political indoctrination, ideological indoctrination. So you would do things like hiking and camping, but you would also learn the rhetoric of the Nazi Party. You would learn the anti-Semitic rhetoric. You would learn the ways to honor Hitler. The Hitler Youth also served as kind of a proto-military organization. You might learn skills like riflery, right? That would be useful if you were to join the Nazi army later on. A third way that the Nazis provided service to the state would be through motherhood. The Nazis had very traditional and conservative ideas about gender roles, and they really discouraged women from doing things like working in factories, but they really honored the idea of being a mother. And in fact, if you were of the Aryan race and you had multiple children, the Nazi state would reward you as they might reward like a military veteran. So those are three ways in which the Nazi Party provided opportunities to serve the state. Now, the other aspect of totalitarianism is terrorism. And the Nazis had two police forces or paramilitary organizations. One was called the SS, the other was called the SA. And remember that there were no civil liberties in Nazi Germany, so you could be arrested for any time and for any reason. And what was the kind of the practical effect of this? Well, you would never be caught criticizing the Nazi state because you really didn't know who was listening. And you might not even confide in close family members because you didn't know who was listening and who might turn you in. And having secret police forces also made it very difficult to have an organized resistance to the Nazi state, right? Because you would be scared that anybody who showed up might report on you to the Nazi authorities, and you would be arrested and taken away to a concentration camp. This also might mean that even if you didn't particularly love the Nazis, you might have a copy of Mein Kampf on your bookshelf or a portrait of Hitler on your wall because you wanted to show that if anybody came into your house, you were loyal to the state and you didn't want anybody to be suspicious of you because you didn't have these things. Okay, so those are some of the characteristics of Nazi totalitarianism. What are some of the examples of racism in Nazi Germany? And of course, there are many. The two that I'm going to be talking about are the Nuremberg laws and Kristallnacht, right? The Nuremberg laws are a set of laws that were passed in 1935 in the German city of Nuremberg, and they were a series of laws that legalized racism and racial segregation, right? So one of the primary things that the Nuremberg laws did is that they stripped Jewish people of their citizenship. It said you are no longer citizens of Germany. And then it also said that non-citizens could not marry German citizens. So in effect, the Jewish people could not marry anybody who was not also Jewish. And the impact of this is that it legalized the dehumanization and the othering of the Jews, right? So by law, the Jews were no longer German, they were other, they were different. So that's one example of racism. A second example of racism is Kristallnacht, which is translated as Night of Crystals. You also see it translated as the Night of Broken Glass. And Kristallnacht is an example of a pogrom, right? So systematic and organized violence against the Jews. And it was organized by the SA, one of the paramilitary police forces. And it was a night on which the SA led and organized attacks on Jewish businesses, Jewish homes, and on Jewish people themselves. So there was physical violence against the Jewish people. And we don't know exactly how many people died on Kristallnacht. We think maybe about 100 people died on Kristallnacht. So this would be another example of racism in Nazi Germany. All right. The third question is about what are some of the things that Hitler did that led to World War II. And in order to answer that question, I need to make a little bit of a digression back to the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. And to remind us that Woodrow Wilson, the American president, one of the things he wanted to do more than anything was to make sure that this World War I was a war to end all wars. And one of the ways that he wanted to achieve this goal is by creating an international organization that he called the League of Nations. And his dream was that if all the nations on Earth got together and had like a place to talk and to work things out, that countries, if there were disputes between countries, they could work them out in this international organization, and thus this international organization would be a way to prevent war. So in his mind, if we went back to 1914, just after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, if there was this international organization for Austria-Hungary and Serbia to kind of work out their differences, that could have been a way to avoid World War I. And of course, that was extremely idealistic of him. But the League of Nations was created by the Treaty of Versailles, but it was weakened right from the beginning because one of the most powerful nations decided not to join. And the powerful nation that decided not to join the League of Nations was the United States. And that could be a little curious. Why, if Wilson wanted this more than anything, did the United States not join the League of Nations? And the answer is because in the United States, the president does not have total power, right? We have a series of checks and balances, and we have a series of checks and balances in our Constitution, and in this particular case, the executive branch, the president, gets to make treaties, but the legislative branch, the Senate, gets to ratify treaties, right? And so when Wilson returns from Paris, he needs to convince the Senate to ratify American entry into the League of Nations. And while the Senate did agree to join World War I, it really saw that as an aberration. But once World War I was over, the Senate was largely isolationist, right? So it didn't want to get involved in international affairs. And so the Senate rejected American entry into the League of Nations, and that made the League of Nations weaker right from the beginning. And this is really important because the League of Nations was responsible for enforcing the terms of the Versailles Treaty, right? So in the Versailles Treaty, Germany agreed to do all these things, but who's going to make sure that Germany actually does the things it says it's going to do in That's going to be the League of Nations. And because the United States is not involved in the League of Nations, it really falls to France and England to enforce the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Okay, so now we can go back to Germany in the year 1935, and remember that part of the reason that Hitler became popular was because he railed against the Versailles Treaty. He said, if I come to power, I'm just going to break the terms of the Versailles Treaty. And the first example of him breaking the terms of the Versailles Treaty is in 1935, when he begins to rearm Germany. Now, remember, in the Versailles Treaty, the Versailles Treaty said that Germany could only have an army of 100,000 soldiers, and it put limits on how many tanks and planes it could have and things like that. In 1935, Nazi Germany begins to rearm in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. And there are three big significances of German rearmament. The first big significance of German rearmament is economic, that investing in its military is a tremendous boost to the German economy. Now, remember, we're in the middle of the Great Depression, so unemployment is super high all over the Western world, particularly in places like England and France and the United States. But because of rearmament, unemployment really dives in Germany, and that really helps the German economy, and particularly in contrast to the rest of the Western powers that are mired in the Great Depression. Okay, so German rearmament really helps the German economy. A second big significance of German rearmament is what France and England do in response. And essentially, France and England really don't do very much at all. They pursue a policy of appeasement, and that's the key word here, is appeasement. They basically say, we are going to let Hitler do certain things if it allows us to avoid another war. So we're not going to go in and enforce the Versailles Treaty because we're worried that if we do enforce the Versailles Treaty, it will lead to another war. And to be fair to France and England, the world is not yet even 20 years removed from the end of World War I, and so the idea of getting involved in yet another war was so troubling to France and England that they were willing to let Hitler violate the terms of the Versailles Treaty in order to avoid another war, and that is called appeasement. The third big significance of German rearmament is that Hitler learns that he can break the terms of the Versailles Treaty with very little consequence, right? So he's openly breaking the Versailles Treaty. France and England do nothing. So he basically thinks to himself, I can continue to break the Versailles Treaty and get away with it. And so in 1936, he moves troops into the Rhineland, which is the border between France and Germany. That again was in violation of the Versailles Treaty. France and England again pursue a policy of appeasement, which again enforces the idea to Hitler that he can break the Versailles Treaty with no consequences. Okay, so the next thing that Hitler does is we'll go back to the idea of Lebensraum, the idea of living space, right? That he believes that the superior races need space to live, and he might need to violently displace the people that are currently living in those places, and that's particularly in Eastern Europe. But he wants to expand the size of the German Empire. And the first place he does that is in Austria, which is his homeland. And he annexes Austria, which is to say, he just says, you are now part of the German Empire. And if you don't want to be, you can fight me over it. But I have a huge army because I've been rearming for several years. And the Austrian people just say, okay, we are now part of the German Empire. So he simply declares that Austria is part of the German Empire, and then it is part of the German Empire because Austria doesn't want to go to war over this. The next place that Hitler wants to annex is a place called the Sudetenland, and the Sudetenland is part of Czechoslovakia. And significantly, France and England had peace treaties, alliances with Czechoslovakia. So Hitler, this was a big test. Like, I am going to do something to one of your allies, and are you going to do anything about it? And in response to Hitler's desire to annex the Sudetenland, there's a very famous meeting in Munich in September of 1938. And this is called the Munich Conference. The Munich Conference in September of 1938. And the goal of the Munich Conference is to figure out this crisis in the Sudetenland. Will Hitler annex this part of Czechoslovakia? And it's a meeting between Germany, France, and England. And this is often called the high water mark of appeasement. This is yet again France and England say, instead of wanting to go to war with Nazi Germany, we are going to let Hitler do what he wants. Let him annex the Sudetenland. And this is the high watermark of appeasement. And famously, the British Prime Minister came out of the conference saying, there will be peace for our time, right? Which is, looking back now, so ironic because, of course, the world is just a year away from the Second World War. So the Munich conference is associated with the policy of appeasement. Okay. The last historical event that really leads to World War II is that after the Sudetenland, the next place that Hitler targets is Poland. And again, France and England have alliances with Poland. So if they invade Poland or annex Poland, what are France and England going to do is kind of an open question. But the lessons Hitler is learning is that I can just do these things and nobody's going to do anything about it. So he's not really worried about France and England. He is, however, worried about another country, which is the Soviet Union. Right? He's worried that if he invades Poland, it's not France and England that's going to respond, but now the Soviet Union is going to respond. And the most shocking moment leading up to World War II is in August of 1939, when Hitler and Stalin signed a pact of non-aggression. So basically, they agreed not to fight each other and to split Poland between them. And this is so shocking. This shocks the world because Hitler came to power railing against communism and railing against the Soviet Union. And similarly, Stalin was saying all these things about Nazi Germany. And so these were two enemies who came together to make a pact of non-aggression. And now that Hitler has made a non-aggression pact with Stalin, he's not worried about France and England, right? Because they've shown over and over again that they're going to pursue a policy of appeasement. And now he's not worried about the Soviet Union either because of this pact of non-aggression that he has signed in August of 1939. And thus, September 1st, 1939, Hitler moves his troops into Poland. But this is actually the last straw for France and England, and they finally decide, no, we do need to intervene, we do need to do something. And so 2 days after the Nazis moved troops into Poland, France and England declare war on Nazi Germany. So that's September 3rd, 1939, and that is the beginning of World War II in Europe. Okay, so that is the video for today, and